A few hundred Spaniards, 16 horses, and a handful of cannon walked into an empire of millions, and within 2 years, that empire simply ceased to exist. And the thing that made it possible wasn't the steel, and it wasn't the gunpowder. The single deadliest weapon the Spanish carried across the ocean was one they couldn't see, couldn't aim, and didn't even know they were carrying. It rode inside their own bodies. It crossed the water in the blood and breath of ordinary men, and when it finally slipped loose in the streets of the largest city in the Americas, it killed on a scale that no army in history had ever matched. The soldiers who unleashed it never fired a shot to do so. That is the strange, uncomfortable heart of one of the most consequential collisions in human history. Start with the city itself, because almost nothing you picture when you hear the word empire prepares you for it. Rise up over the Valley of Mexico 500 years ago and look down. In the middle of a wide, shallow lake sits an island, and on that island stands a metropolis unlike anything in Europe. Originally located on 2 small islands in Lake Texcoco, it gradually spread through the construction of artificial islands to cover more than 5 square miles, connected to the mainland by several causeways, and its population in the year 1519 was estimated to be about 400,000 people, the largest residential concentration in Mesoamerican history. Historians argue about that top figure. Some put it closer to 200,000, but even the low end dwarfed almost everything in the Old World. The population of Tenochtitlan is estimated at between 200,000 and 300,000 people, while London at the same time had around 50 to 70,000, and Paris around 200,000. Sit with that comparison for a moment. The Spanish soldiers who would one day march down its avenues came, most of them, from dusty villages in western Spain. To them, a real city meant a place of maybe 10 or 15,000 souls. What they were about to see was a city that could swallow 20 of their hometowns and still have room to breathe. And it wasn't just big. It was engineered in a way that would put most of 16th century Europe to shame. Tenochtitlan had a functioning aqueduct system that brought fresh water into the city. It had a sewage and waste management system, and it had floating agricultural gardens called chinampas built on the lake that produced food year-round. Think about what that means. While the great capitals of Europe were emptying their chamber pots into open gutters and drinking from fouled rivers, this island city was pumping clean mountain water across a lake on stone channels, and growing its own food on rafts of woven reeds and lake mud. Tenochtitlan dazzled its invaders. It was bigger than Paris, Europe's greatest metropolis, and the Spaniards gawped like yokels at the wide streets, ornately carved buildings, and markets bright with goods from hundreds of miles away, while boats flitted like butterflies around the 3 grand causeways that linked the city to the mainland. But hold that image of beauty in your head, because there was another engine running underneath it, one that fed the city's power and terrified everyone who lived in its shadow. Tenochtitlan sat at the center of a machine of tribute. Conquered towns for hundreds of miles around shipped it a river of goods: cloth, cacao, feathers, gold, food, and people. And this is where the story gets dark. At the heart of the city stood a great twin temple, and in front of it, something the Spanish would describe with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Using sharp blades, the priests cut away the skin and muscles of the face, reducing it to a skull, then carved large holes in both sides and slipped it onto a thick wooden post that held other skulls prepared the same way, all bound for the Tzompantli, an enormous rack of skulls built in front of the Templo Mayor. For a long time, historians assumed the Spanish had simply made this up, grotesque propaganda to justify the slaughter that followed. Then the ground gave up its secrets. In 2015 and 2018, archaeologists working at the Templo Mayor excavation site in Mexico City discovered evidence of human sacrifice among the Aztecs, including the skull towers and skull racks that conquistadors had described in their accounts. The eyewitnesses, it turned out, weren't inventing the towers of the dead. They were describing something real. Now, we need to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of place where legend swallows fact. The most famous numbers are almost certainly wild exaggerations. The Spanish historian, Fray Diego de Duran, claimed that a single temple dedication was celebrated by the mass sacrifice of 80,000 men, women, and children, though other reports put the number closer to 20,000, or as few as 4,000, over a 4-day ceremony. Whatever the true figure, the deeper point holds. This was a system, deliberate and religious, and it ran on a steady supply of captives taken in war. Warfare, including ritualized flower wars against neighboring city-states, was explicitly oriented toward procuring captives for sacrifice, embedding the practice in military culture. And here is the part that decides everything that follows. That machine of tribute and blood made Tenochtitlan rich and feared, but it also made it hated. Every town that shipped grain and gold and prisoners to the island did so with a grievance sewn into it. While the Aztecs' monetary and religious demands empowered the empire, it also fostered resentment among surrounding city-states. The empire looked, from the outside, like an unbreakable thing. In reality, it was a ring of enemies held together by fear. All it would take to shatter it was someone willing to hand those enemies a weapon and a leader. Into that world, from over the eastern sea, came a man who was not supposed to be there at all. His name was Hernán Cortés, and understand this from the start. He wasn't sent by a king with a grand plan. He was, in effect, a fugitive. While stationed in Cuba, he convinced Cuban Governor Diego Velázquez to allow him to lead an expedition to Mexico, but Velázquez then canceled his mission. Cortés ignored the cancellation. He loaded his ships and sailed anyway, which, under Spanish law, made him something close to a pirate, a man acting without authority, who would either return in triumph or return in chains. Eager to appropriate new land for the Spanish crown, convert indigenous people to Christianity, and plunder the region for gold and riches, Cortés organized his own rogue crew of 100 sailors, 11 ships, 508 soldiers, and 16 horses. Let that force sink in. 500 men, 16 horses, a handful of cannon, against an empire of millions with a capital larger than Paris. On paper, it is not a bold plan. It is a suicide note. Cortés knew exactly how thin his position was, and that leads to the single most legendary act of the entire expedition, the moment he made retreat impossible. Not long after landing on the coast and founding a rough settlement, some of his men began to lose their nerve. They'd seen the size of what lay inland. They wanted to sail back to Cuba, back to safety, back to the governor. Cortés's answer was to take the one thing that made escape possible and destroy it. The Spanish adventurer had two options in 1519: face mutiny or quell a rebellion by scuttling 10 of his 11 ships, which would give the crews no option but to move inland with him toward the heart of the Mexica Empire. Now, here's where I want to be honest with you, because this is a case where the famous version and the real one don't quite match. The image everyone carries, Cortés dramatically setting his fleet ablaze on the beach, is mostly a later invention. Some think he burned the vessels, and others believe he beached them, and the notion that he burned his ships did not become accepted until 250 years later. He probably ran them aground and stripped them, salvaging the sails and metal to build his settlement. But whether it was fire or a hull broken open on the sand, the meaning was identical, and the message was ice cold. There was no way home. The men around him now had exactly two futures: conquest or death in a foreign land. And the wreck wasn't just a story. There is a physical trail. An iron anchor, consistent with the type carried by European ships in the early 16th century, has been discovered off the coast where Cortes founded a settlement in 1519. The bones of that fleet may still be lying in the sand off the Mexican coast. So picture the position now. A few hundred men, cut off from the sea, standing on the edge of a continent they barely understand, facing an empire that outnumbers them by a factor of thousands. Everything depended on one thing they didn't have. They couldn't speak a single word of the language. To them, the whole empire was noise. They couldn't negotiate, couldn't spy, couldn't turn enemies into allies, couldn't do anything but fight blindly and die. An invader who cannot talk is just a target. And then, almost by accident, the most important weapon of the entire conquest was handed to Cortes. Not a cannon, not a horse, but a person. A young woman, given away as property. After a battle on the coast, a local people handed the Spanish the usual peace offering: gold, cloth, and a group of enslaved women. When Cortes conquered the Maya city of Potonchan in 1519, its inhabitants gave him gifts of gold and enslaved women and girls, including the woman history would come to call La Malinche. She was, most likely, still in her late teens. She'd already lived a life that would break most people. Born to a noble family around the year 1500, she grew up in the Nahuatl-speaking borderlands of the Aztec and Mayan worlds, and when her father died and her mother remarried, she was sold to Mayan slave traders. And that terrible journey, that being sold from her own people into a foreign land, was exactly what made her, in that moment, the most valuable human being on the continent. Because of where she'd been born and where she'd been sold, she carried something almost no one else in the world possessed: two languages on two sides of the Great Divide. During her travels, she became fluent in both Yucatec and Nahuatl, the languages of the Mayan and Aztec people, and she also spoke High Nahuatl, the language of the Cortes, which supports her claim to noble birth. Watch how the pieces click together, because it's almost eerie. Cortes already had a Spaniard who'd been shipwrecked years earlier and had learned to speak Mayan while living as a captive. He spoke Spanish and Maya, but not a word of the Aztec tongue. This young woman spoke Maya and the Aztec tongue, but no Spanish. Put them side by side, and suddenly a chain forms across two worlds. Under this arrangement, the Spaniard translated Spanish into Mayan, and she then translated from Mayan into Nahuatl, a method that allowed Cortes to speak with local leaders who otherwise had no direct way to understand his intentions. Think of it as a relay race for words. Cortes speaks in Spanish. It passes to the shipwrecked Spaniard, who converts it to Maya. It passes to her, who converts it to the language of the Aztec court. And for the first time, the empire can hear the invader, and the invader can hear the empire. Clumsy, slow, 3 mouths for every sentence, but it worked, and she was brilliant at it. She became Cortes's mistress, and she is said to have learned Spanish within months, collapsing that 3-person chain down to just her, sitting at his side, translating directly. From that point on, she was not a tool. She was the nervous system of the whole enterprise. You cannot overstate what she meant. One of the soldiers who marched the entire campaign said it plainly, decades later. Díaz del Castillo wrote that without Doña Marina, we could not have understood the language of New Spain and Mexico. No interpreter, no alliances. No alliances, no army. No army, and Cortez and his 500 men are a footnote. A doomed little band swallowed by the interior. The whole conquest ran through her voice. That is why, 5 centuries later, she remains one of the most bitterly argued over figures in all of Mexican history. She was instrumental to the success of the Spanish conquest and is regarded at once a traitor to her people, a symbol of indigenous responses to colonial power, and an exemplar of survival and resilience. And it's worth pausing on the injustice buried in that word, traitor. Some observers question the fairness of calling her a traitor, and passing judgment on her relationship with Cortez and the Spanish conquest of Mexico, pointing out that being sold as a slave into that relationship was clearly not a personal decision. She never chose the Spanish. She was given to them as property after a battle she had no part in. And yet everything that followed, the alliances, the marches, the massacres, the fall of the greatest city in the Americas, would flow through the words that came out of her mouth. So now the machine is assembled. A commander who has burned his own bridges and cannot go home. A relay of interpreters that lets him finally speak to the land he's walked into. 500 desperate men, and an empire that looks invincible, but is secretly ringed by people who would give almost anything to see it burn. What Cortez did not yet fully understand, what he was about to discover as he turned his back on the sea and started walking inland toward the mountains, was just how much those enemies of the empire hated Tenochtitlan, and just how willing they were to bleed for the chance to bring it down. The first of them was waiting for him in the highlands, and they would not greet him with gifts. They would greet him with tens of thousands of warriors, and they would very nearly finish his story before it had truly begun. When Cortez turned inland and started climbing toward the high plateau, he was walking into a story that had nothing to do with him, a war between neighbors that had already been running for generations. And the genius of what he did next, if you can call it genius, was that he didn't try to conquer that quarrel. He plugged himself into it. The empire of Tenochtitlan wasn't a solid block. Picture it more like a mafia stretched across a whole country. A network of towns forced to pay protection money in cloth, food, gold, and human beings. All of it flowing toward one island in the middle of a lake. And like any protection racket, it bred a very specific emotion in the people paying. Not loyalty, but a slow, grinding hatred, waiting for a crack to pour into. As Cortez marched, he kept meeting the men who ran these towns, and through the relay of interpreters at his side, he heard the same thing again and again. They were sick of the tribute. They were sick of the priests coming to collect prisoners. Some of them started sizing up these strange, bearded newcomers not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The Spanish learned this piece by piece, town by town, and they were still learning it when they slammed into the one people who would decide the entire war. A nation that had never bowed to Tenochtitlan at all. They were called the Tlaxcalans, and their position in this world was extraordinary. Tlaxcala was a confederation of city-states sitting in the highlands, completely surrounded by Aztec-controlled territory, an island of independence in a sea of empire. Imagine a small, free country ringed on every side by a hostile superpower, blockaded for decades, cut off from salt and cotton and trade, and still refusing to submit. That was Tlaxcala. And they hadn't just endured, they'd spent generation after generation locked in ritualized combat with Tenochtitlan, in the so-called Flower Wars, brutal engagements whose whole purpose was to capture enemy warriors for sacrifice. These two peoples had been feeding each other to the gods for as long as anyone could remember. The hatred between them was ancient, personal, and total. So when a few hundred foreigners came marching through their land, the Tlaxcalans did not roll out gifts. They tried to wipe the Spanish out. And here is a fact that gets buried under the myth of European invincibility. The battles against Tlaxcala were among the hardest the Spanish would fight in the entire campaign, harder in many ways than anything Tenochtitlan itself would throw at them. Wave after wave of Tlaxcalan warriors came at the little Spanish column over the course of days. The Spanish dug in, fired their cannon and the crossbows, and rode their horses into massed infantry. And they held. Barely. Some of the soldiers were wounded, some of the horses were killed, and the men spent their nights dressing wounds and expecting to die in the morning. If the Tlaxcalans had thrown their full strength at those exhausted, outnumbered strangers all at once, the story of the conquest would have ended right there in the highlands. But they didn't. And this is the turn that changes everything. And it's important to see it as cold calculation on both sides, not some fairy tale of friendship. The Tlaxcalan leaders, watching these outsiders survive assault after assault, made a decision that would reshape a continent. Instead of a 101st attack, they offered an alliance. Their logic was ruthless and clear. Here, at last, was a wild card that might crack the empire that had strangled them for a lifetime. If these foreigners wanted to march on the hated city in the lake, then let them. And let Tlaxcala march with them, right to its gates. Understand what that means, because it flips the entire picture. This was never 500 Spaniards toppling an empire. From this moment on, Cortes commanded an army that was overwhelmingly indigenous. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors who knew the land, knew the enemy, knew how the empire fought, and how it could be broken. The Spanish were the strange edge of the blade. The Tlaxcalans were the arm swinging it. When historians talk about the fall of Tenochtitlan, this is the fact they keep coming back to. The empire wasn't destroyed by outsiders. It was destroyed by its own neighbors, who finally found a spear sharp enough to use. The people in the great city on the lake heard about all of this. Runners carried the news across the causeways. Foreigners, unkillable in battle, riding beasts no one had seen, and now marching in company with Tlaxcala. And the response from Tenochtitlan was not to send an army. It was to send an invitation, wrapped in a plan. The emperor's messengers steered Cortes toward the next great city on the road, a place called Cholula, a sacred city, an ally of the empire, and, if the Spanish accounts are to be believed, a trap. Cholula was not just any town. It was a holy place, one of the oldest in Mesoamerica, crowned by an enormous pyramid dedicated to the feathered serpent god. Pilgrims came from all over. To walk into Cholula was to walk into a cathedral city, a place of priests and temples and sacred authority. And it was here, on the road to the empire's heart, that the march turned into a bloodbath. What exactly happened in Cholula is one of the most bitterly disputed episodes of the whole conquest. So let me lay out what the sources actually claim, rather than pretend we know for certain. According to the Spanish, and according to the woman interpreting at Cortez's side, the Cholulans were preparing an ambush. The story goes that she was approached by a local noblewoman who tried to warn her to get her out of the city before the killing started, that the streets had been readied, that warriors were hidden, that pits had been dug and stones piled on the rooftops. She reported it all to Cortes. Whether that warning was real, exaggerated, or invented afterward to justify what came next, we genuinely cannot say. Historians have argued about it for centuries. But what the Spanish did in response is not in doubt, and it is chilling in its coldness. Cortez summoned the city's leaders and a mass of unarmed men into an enclosed courtyard beside the great temple, a walled space, the exits controlled by his own soldiers. And then, on his signal, the killing began. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies fell on the trapped crowd and slaughtered them. It went on for hours. Thousands died. The figures the sources give run into the thousands, and some go far higher. In a courtyard they could not escape from, cut down by steel and by allies who had every old grievance to settle. When it spilled out into the city, temples were burned and the sacred center was left in ruins. Now step back and think about why a commander would do this. Because there was a logic to it, and it's a genuinely disturbing logic. Cholula was a message. The road to Tenochtitlan was lined with cities watching to see what these newcomers were. By turning a holy city's own temple courtyard into a killing ground, the Spanish sent a signal that traveled faster than they did. Resist us, and this is what happens. Even to a sacred place under the Empire's protection. Terror as a weapon, aimed not at Cholula, but at everyone downstream of it. And it worked. The story of the massacre ran ahead of the marching column all the way to the lake. By the time Cortez climbed the pass and looked down for the first time at the valley of Tenochtitlan, the Empire's ruler had already heard, in gruesome detail, what these people were capable of. And that is the pass I want you to stand on now. Because the moment the Spanish came over the mountains and saw the city for the first time is one of the few in this entire story where the eyewitnesses drop the bravado and just sound stunned. Look down with them. A vast bowl of land, filled edge to edge with water. Great linked lakes glittering in the mountain light. Towns crowding the shorelines. And out in the middle of all that water, connected to the land by long, straight causeways running for miles across the surface, the city itself. White towers, temple pyramids, palaces, gardens, all of it seeming to float on the lake. The old soldier who wrote the fullest account of that day, decades later, could still barely put it into words. He described the men wondering whether what they were seeing was even real, whether it was a dream. They came from a Europe where a real city meant crooked streets and church spires you could count on one hand. In front of them was a metropolis larger than any of them had ever seen, laid out with a geometric order that European cities simply did not have. Sitting on a lake, like something out of a vision. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. They were walking toward it anyway. A few hundred foreigners and their allies, staring down at a city of hundreds of thousands, choosing to march across a narrow, raised road in single-file stretches, out over open water, into the middle of the most powerful capital in the Americas, with only one way in and one way out. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed against it. They went. The meeting happened on the causeway itself, at the gates of the city, and it is one of those rare moments where two entire worlds stood face to face, and each tried to read the other. On one side, the emperor of the Mexica, Moctezuma, ruler of an empire of millions, a figure so exalted that his own subjects were not permitted to look him in the eye. On the other, a rogue Spanish captain leading a column of tired men and their tens of thousands of indigenous allies. They exchanged gifts, They exchanged careful, guarded courtesies through the chain of interpreters. Moctezuma had the newcomers escorted into the city and housed them in a great palace complex. And each side, watching the other, believed it was the one setting the trap. We need to be careful about what was really going through Moctezuma's mind, because for centuries there was a tidy legend that he thought Cortez was a returning god and froze up in superstitious terror. Modern historians treat that story with deep suspicion. It fits far too neatly, and much of it was written down long after the fact, possibly to make the Spanish victory feel preordained rather than the messy, contingent, blood-soaked thing it actually was. The likelier truth is more human and more calculating. Moctezuma had let a dangerous, unpredictable force walk into the one place he could most tightly control: his own island, his own city, reachable only by causeways he could cut. Inviting the wolf inside the sheepfold makes a certain sense if you're confident you can close the gate behind it. He was gathering information. He was keeping his enemies where he could see them. He was, in his own way, doing exactly what Cortez was doing, sizing up the threat while smiling. But only one side moved first, and what the Spanish did next was so audacious that it still barely seems possible. Within days of being welcomed as guests into the heart of a city of hundreds of thousands, a few hundred foreigners seized the emperor. Let that sink in for a second. They did not fight their way to him. They did not besiege him. They were his guests, housed in his own palace complex, deep inside his own capital, surrounded on every side by his own people and reachable only across water. And they simply took him. Cortez, with a handful of armed men at his back, confronted Moctezuma inside his own walls and pressured him, through the interpreter, as always, to leave his palaces and come live under Spanish guard, as a hostage in all but name. And astonishingly, the emperor went. Why he allowed it is another of those questions that historians still turn over. Maybe he calculated that cooperation bought time. Maybe he genuinely believed he could still play these strangers, ruling as before, with them as an awkward presence at his shoulder. Maybe, hemmed in by armed men in a confined room, he simply saw no clean way to refuse without triggering the very bloodbath he was trying to avoid. Whatever the reasoning, the result was one of the strangest arrangements in the history of empire. The most powerful ruler in the Americas, still wearing all the trappings of his office, still receiving his nobles, still issuing commands, but doing all of it as a captive, with Spanish guards at the door and a foreign captain deciding how far his authority now reached. And for a while, incredibly, it held. Cortez ruled Tenochtitlan through Moctezuma like a hand inside a glove. Orders still went out in the emperor's name. Tribute still flowed. The machinery of the empire kept turning, only now there was a foreign hand on the lever. From the outside, to the ordinary people of the city, it may have looked almost normal at first. The emperor was there, the temples still stood, the markets still roared. But underneath, the city was changing temperature. You can feel it building in the accounts. The nobles could see that their god-king was not free. The priests could see that their temples were being insulted, their idols challenged, the newcomers demanding that the sacrifices stop and crosses go up in the sacred places. The warriors could see foreign guards in the palace of the Mexica. Every day the situation held, the pressure underneath it climbed. Tens of thousands of proud, armed people watching their sacred order be quietly hijacked from within, and waiting, the way a crowd waits before it becomes a mob, for one spark. The emperor was a prisoner in his own home. The Spanish were a few hundred strong, in a city that could raise armies from its own streets. The causeways that had carried them in so easily were narrow, raised roads over open water, and any child in Tenochtitlan could see that a road with water on both sides works just as well as a trap as a bridge. The spark, when it came, would not come from Moctezuma, and it would not come from Cortes. It would come during a festival, a great sacred gathering in the temple precinct. The nobles of the city assembled in their finest, dancing in the sacred courtyard, and it would turn the fragile, impossible balance of that captive empire into a night of fire and blood that no one, on either side, would walk away from unchanged. The festival was one of the most sacred nights on the Mexica calendar. In the great walled temple precinct at the heart of the city, the nobles of Tenochtitlan gathered in their finest. Feathered headdresses, gold, jade, the flower of the warrior aristocracy. And they danced. Hundreds of them, unarmed, deep inside their own sacred ground, moving through the ancient rhythms in front of the temples. And this is where the whole fragile arrangement came apart, and it came apart in the worst possible way. Cortes wasn't even in the city. He'd been forced to march back to the coast to deal with another Spanish force sent to arrest him. Remember, he was technically an outlaw, and his own countrymen had come to bring him down. He beat them and absorbed their men. But while he was gone, he'd left the garrison in the hands of one of his officers. And that officer, watching the temple fill with dancing warriors, made a decision that lit the fuse on everything. He ordered his men to seal the exits of the temple courtyard and slaughter the dancers. It was Cholula all over again, except now it was in the sacred heart of the empire's own capital, and the dead were the empire's own nobility. The Spanish fell on the unarmed celebrants in an enclosed space, cutting down the flower of Mexica society as they danced. Why he did it is argued to this day. Fear of an ambush, a preemptive strike, sheer panic at being a few hundred men adrift in an ocean of hundreds of thousands. The reasoning barely matters. The result was that the city, which had been simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. Tenochtitlan rose. Not a riot, an uprising. The causeways filled with warriors, the canals swarmed with war canoes. The Spanish and their allies, holed up in the palace complex, suddenly found themselves besieged inside the very city they thought they'd captured. And now Moctezuma, the captive emperor, was worth nothing to anyone. His own people no longer recognized his authority. They had already, in effect, chosen new leadership and turned on the puppet in the palace. The Spanish sources say Cortes, back now and trapped with his men, sent Moctezuma up to a rooftop or a wall to calm the crowd, to order them to stand down. And the crowd answered their god-king with stones. According to those accounts, Moctezuma was struck by rocks hurled by his own people and died of the wounds days later. The indigenous accounts tell a darker version, that the Spanish simply killed him once he'd become useless and dumped the body. We will probably never know which is true, but the meaning is the same either way. The man who had ruled millions, whose subjects were forbidden even to look at his face, ended either murdered by strangers in a back room or stoned by the very people he had ruled. There is no version of that death that isn't a humiliation. And now the Spanish were trapped in a hostile city, with no emperor to hide behind, hundreds of miles from any hope of rescue, on an island reachable only by causeways their enemies now controlled. They had exactly one option: run. And running meant crossing those narrow raised roads over open water, at night, with a whole city hunting them. That night has a name that survived 5 centuries. The Spanish called it the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. They tried to slip out along one of the western causeways in the dark, dragging a makeshift portable bridge to span the gaps where the Mexica had cut the roadway. And they were carrying gold, pounds and pounds of looted treasure, so much that some of the men stuffed it into their clothing and their packs. The Mexica caught them out on the causeway. What happened next was a nightmare in the truest sense of the word. Picture a narrow stone road, water black on both sides, the gaps in the roadway yawning open, and out of the darkness, thousands of war canoes closing in from every direction. Fighting on a causeway is like fighting in a hallway. Your numbers mean nothing. Only the few men at the front can swing a weapon, and there is nowhere to run but forward or into the water. The column jammed up at the broken gaps. Men fell in, and the ones weighed down with gold sank like anchors and drowned. There's a bitter, famous line from the Chronicles that the soldiers who died richest died first, dragged straight to the bottom by the treasure they refused to drop. By dawn, Cortez had lost, depending on which account you trust, more than half his Spaniards and thousands upon thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies. It was the worst defeat of his life. The empire had, for one night, won. The invaders were shattered, bleeding, and running for the mountains. If the story of the conquest were about steel and courage and horses, it would have ended right there on that dark causeway, with the survivors limping away in defeat. But the story wasn't really about any of those things. And this is the part I still find genuinely hard to sit with. Because while the Mexico was celebrating driving the foreigners out, a second invader was already loose inside the city. And it didn't need causeways or cannon or allies. It had come in the body of a single sick man. Somewhere in the Spanish reinforcements, the very force sent from the coast to arrest Cortes, the men he'd defeated and folded into his own, there was, according to the sources, one enslaved African man carrying smallpox. One person. That's all it took. You have to understand what smallpox meant to a population that had never encountered it. In the Old World, centuries of exposure had left most people with some resistance. It was a killer of children, terrible but familiar. The peoples of the Americas had never met it. Never. Their immune systems had no memory of it whatsoever. When it landed, it didn't behave like an ordinary epidemic that kills the weak and spares the strong. It killed everyone. The young, the old, the strongest warriors, the priests, the nobles, entire households at once. This is what historians call a virgin soil epidemic, and the numbers it produced are almost impossible to hold in your head. Think of it this way. When a fire hits a forest that burns every few years, there's not much dry fuel. It stays small. But a forest that has never burned, where dead wood has been piling up for 1,000 years, the first spark turns into an inferno that consumes everything. That was smallpox in Mesoamerica. The dry fuel was an entire hemisphere of human beings with no immunity at all. The disease tore through Tenochtitlan in the months after the Night of Sorrows. And here is the fact that reframes the entire conquest. The plague did more damage to the defenders in a few weeks than the Spanish army had managed to do in a year of fighting. The chroniclers describe streets and houses full of the dead, so many corpses that there was no one left healthy enough to bury them, families dying together where they lay. And among the victims was the empire's brand new ruler, the successor who had replaced the disgraced Moctezuma, an energetic leader who had rallied the city and driven the invaders out. He caught it and died within about 80 days of taking the throne. The very man who had just won the greatest victory the empire would ever have was dead of a disease no one in his city had a name for. Sit with the scale of that. Estimates suggest the epidemics that swept the Americas over the following decades killed a staggering share of the entire indigenous population, figures ranging up to 80 or 90% in the worst-hit regions. It is very likely the single greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. And it wasn't planned. Nobody in 1520 understood germs. The Spanish had no idea what they were carrying. It was an accident of biology, an invisible cargo that came ashore in one man's blood and did what 500 soldiers with steel and cannon never could have done alone. The Mexica watched their strongest people rot from the inside out and had no explanation for why the foreigners walked among the dying almost untouched. Imagine what that does to the will of a civilization. Not just to lose a battle, but to watch your gods, your priests, your emperor, and half of everyone you've ever known die of something you cannot see, fight, or comprehend. When Cortez came back, and he did come back, patched up, reinforced, and burning with purpose, he came back to a city that was already half a graveyard. And now the man who had escaped the causeway in shattered defeat did something that tells you everything about how coldly he'd read this war. He had learned the lesson of the Noche Triste. You cannot win a fight on the causeways. You cannot win in the canals, so long as the Mexica owned the water. The lake was their moat and their highway. So he decided to take the lake away from them. He ordered the construction of a fleet of ships, small, purpose-built warships called brigantines, designed to be armed with cannon and to dominate the open water. But he built them in the highlands, far from the lake, among his Tlaxcalan allies. And then his men and thousands of indigenous laborers hauled the pieces, or the raw timber and rigging, overland, across mountains and forest, to the shore of the lake, where they were assembled and launched. Stop and picture the sheer strangeness of that. A navy carried on human backs over the mountains to be floated on a lake in the middle of a continent. Cortes deployed 13 such warships, each carrying 25 men, along with crossbowmen and harquebusiers. It's one of the most audacious pieces of military engineering in the whole story, and it flipped the war completely. Now the Spanish owned the water. The war canoes that had massacred them on the Night of Sorrows were suddenly outgunned by cannon riding on the lake itself. Then came the siege. And this is where the Great Conquest reveals its true face, which is not a glorious battle, but a long, grinding act of strangulation. Tenochtitlan's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. It was an island. Everything it needed came in over the causeways and across the water. So Cortez cut all of it. His allies, and by now his indigenous army numbered in the tens of thousands, dwarfing his few hundred Spaniards many times over, closed off every causeway. His brigantines patrolled the lake, sinking the supply canoes and cutting the city off from the mainland farms that fed it. And then he did the coldest, most decisive thing of all. He destroyed the aqueduct. Remember that beautiful engineering, the stone channels that carried fresh mountain water across the lake into the city. For a metropolis of hundreds of thousands sitting in a lake of undrinkable brackish water, that aqueduct was life itself. Cortez broke it. And with that single act, he condemned the entire population to thirst on top of starvation. A city on the water, dying for want of water. The siege lasted about 93 days, and it was not a clean thing. Street by street, canal by canal, the attackers ground their way in, and every time they took ground and pulled back, the defenders would reclaim it in the night. So Cortez changed tactics. He began tearing the city down as he advanced, leveling the houses and filling the canals with the rubble so his horses and his men could fight on solid, open ground. Think about that as a method of war. You don't just capture the city, you dismantle it as you go, so that behind the advancing line there is nothing left standing. The most magnificent city in the Americas was being fed into its own canals, building by building, to make a road for the men killing it. Inside those shrinking blocks, the defenders were living a horror that the sources describe without any need for exaggeration. The people were dying of hunger and thirst and disease all at once. They ate anything: lake weeds, insects, the bark off the walls, the mud itself. And still they would not surrender. Understand that these were people who had ruled everything in sight for a lifetime, whose city was the center of the known world, whose gods demanded that they fight. Their resistance in those final weeks, starving and plague-ridden and outnumbered, is one of the most stubborn last stands in recorded history. At the center of it, holding the remnants together, was the last emperor of the Mexica, a young ruler who had come to the throne in the middle of the catastrophe and refused to break. As the city collapsed around him street by street, he fought on from the last unconquered quarter, from among the ruins and the corpses and the dry canals. And when the end finally came, and the resistance had nowhere left to stand, he tried to escape across the water by canoe, and was captured on the lake by one of the very brigantines that had stolen his empire's greatest advantage. The sources say that when he was brought before Cortes, this last emperor did something extraordinary. He reportedly asked to be killed. He pointed to the dagger at Cortes's belt and said, in effect, that he had done what he could to defend his people, and that now it was over, the captain should take the blade and finish him. He was not killed then. He was kept alive as a prisoner, useful for a while, and executed years later on a distant expedition, hanged on Cortes's orders far from the city he had died defending. The last god-king of the Mexica ended dangling from a tree in a jungle, on the word of the man who had unmade his world. And so, after 93 days, the greatest city in the Americas fell silent. What Cortes and his allies walked into was not a prize. It was a ruin. The temples thrown down, the canals choked with rubble and the dead. The population, that city of hundreds of thousands, larger than Paris, engineered more cleanly than any capital in Europe, reduced to a starving, plague-hollowed remnant, picking through the wreckage of a civilization. The chroniclers on both sides describe a stench of death so total that the survivors had to be led out of the corpse-filled streets. The Spanish did not simply abandon the ruins. In an act that is almost brutally symbolic, they built their new capital directly on top of the old one, leveling what remained of the sacred center and raising their own cathedral and palaces over the bones of the Templo Mayor. The city on the lake became the seat of a new empire, the capital of what they called New Spain, and eventually the foundation of the modern metropolis of Mexico City. The lake was gradually drained over the following centuries. Today, some 20 million people live in that basin, and beneath their streets, beneath the subway lines and the traffic, the skull racks and the temple foundations still lie, exactly where the archaeologists dug them up. So what does all of this actually tell us? This story of how a few hundred outlaws and an empire's worth of vengeful neighbors and one sick man brought down a civilization of millions. I think the honest lesson is not the one we were taught. The comfortable version, plucky Europeans, superior steel, brave conquest, is almost entirely wrong. The empire was not beaten by 500 foreigners. It was beaten by its own enemies, whom it had spent generations grinding under tribute and dragging to the sacrificial stone, and who seized the first chance to bring a spear sharp enough to finish the job. It was beaten by an interpreter's voice, by a burned fleet, by a massacre used as a message, and by the sheer nerve of men who kidnapped a god-king in his own palace. And then, most of all, it was beaten by something no one could see, plan, or fight. A virus that killed more people in a season than every sword in the Spanish army could kill in a decade. That's the part that should stay with you. We tend to imagine civilizations dying in a single dramatic moment, a battle, a betrayal, a city in flames. But Tenochtitlan teaches something stranger and more frightening. A civilization can be the largest, the richest, the most advanced thing anyone has ever built, ruled by a man his own people cannot look in the eye. And it can be gutted not by a bigger army, but by all the grudges it never bothered to soothe, and by an accident of biology it had no way to understand. The empire that felt eternal was hollow at the core, held together by fear, and it went from the height of its power to a rubble-filled lake in roughly 2 years. The greatest city in the Americas is still down there, under the traffic and the concrete, quietly reminding anyone who digs deep enough that nothing is too big to vanish.